Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's talk. My name is Ari Kelman. I'm a member of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and on behalf of our director, Charlata von Robert, and the other faculty in the Taube Center, I want to welcome you this afternoon. Before we get started, I want to thank Rachel and Sahar and Linda for organizing this, as they do such a magnificent job of organizing all of our events all year long, so thank you. I also want to, before I introduce our speaker, alert you to the rest of our programs this year. It's a really packed schedule. They all look fantastic. I particularly want to highlight, not because none of the other speakers are fantastic, just because, the Jewish Community Federation Endowment Fund lecture on May 15th. Michael Twitty, who's a TED Fellow, a 2 times James Beard Award winner, culinary historian, an African foodways expert, is coming to speak about sort of Jewish black syntheses in food, and it should be a dynamite talk. So the details are, as always, on our website, but also you can pick up a handout on the way out. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Eddy Portnoy to speak this evening. Eddy earned a PhD in history from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a master's in Yiddish studies from Columbia. He's a specialist in Jewish popular culture and publishes regularly in The Forward, the Jewish Daily Forward, formerly known, and Tablet Magazine, as well as a variety of other outlets. Dr. Portnoy is a special kind of genius when it comes to the study of Jewish culture. In a sense, he's a scholar's scholar. He probably has more appearances in the acknowledgments of books on Jewish history than anybody else that I can think of. Which is to say that when people have questions about sort of what seem like small things in Jewish history, they go to Eddy. Some of that comes from his perspective on Jewish history around the world, which comes not from high theory or big ideas about history or historiography, but from the careful reading of the Yiddish Press in the United States and Europe, day by day, week by week, headline by headline, column by column, and most importantly, comic by comic. His eye for the obscure and the offbeat, the unseemly, the curious, the otherwise discarded, as well as the profound, has led him to write articles about Jewish puppetry, Jewish tattoo artists, wrestlers, science fiction, the iconography of noses, murderers, mystics, mediums, Svengalis, psychics, and all kinds of other characters that populated and still populate the margins of our societies. The truly masterful dimension of his research is that these seemingly strange kind of marginal types are always about 1 or 2 degrees removed from the vaunted towering figures about whom history is sort of normally written. The result of Dr. Portnoy's research is an incredibly granular understanding of both the daily lives of Jews and the accumulation of those daily events into what we ultimately think of as Jewish history, writ large. To put it slightly differently, Dr. Portnoy is an expert of Jewish history, writ small. He currently serves as the academic advisor to the Max Weinreich Center and exhibition curator at YIVO, the Yiddish Cultural Institute, where he put on a great exhibition called Jews in Space, and is working on one now on Yiddish typewriters. He is the author of the book, Bad Rabbi and Other Strange but True Stories from the Yiddish Press, that came out on Stanford University Press 2 years ago, and is for sale from the bookstore, so I want to thank the bookstore also for coming and representing. In Bad Rabbi, in the book, Eddy renders many of the fascinating stories from the Yiddish Press into beautiful English so that we can hear about the hidden heroes of the underclass, as he calls them. In his review of Bad Rabbi in the New York Times Book Review, Jay Hoberman reflected on both Portnoy's keen sense of the outrageous and noted his chops as a storyteller in his own right. So Hoberman, writing about Eddy, writes, quote, Portnoy's chapter on the madcap sectarian battles occasioned by the Miss Judea beauty contest of 1929, is itself a gem of comic writing with a ferocious kicker worthy of either of the brothers Singer. Hoberman's high praise is suited to the book and to Dr. Portnoy, whose documentation of the underbelly of Jewish history is also itself, I think, a significant contribution to our understanding of Jewish history as it is. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eddy Portnoy.
Thank you, Ari, and Linda, and everyone who helped organize this, and thanks to all of you for coming. That was a really wonderful introduction. I don't really know who you were talking about. I'm so much less interesting than that. So, okay, I know we're about to hit Passover, but I'd like to begin with a little slice of Jewish life vignette regarding events that occurred on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, that were reported on in the Vorwärts, in the Jewish Daily Forward, the Yiddish version, on September 19th, 1907. And this report reads as follows. Yom Kippur services in a Clinton Street hall were disrupted due to a fight over a chair. When Joseph Rand showed up in Shul with his family, he discovered that one Herman Garber was sitting in one of the seats he had reserved. Rand informed Garber that he was in one of his seats, but Garber produced a ticket indicating that Rand was wrong and that it was, in fact, his seat. Rand responded by punching Garber in the face. Not to be outdone, Garber tore out part of Rand's beard. The lion-like voice of the cantor was drowned out by the screams and howls of the fighting congregants. In the end, both Rand and Garber were forced to finish the Musaf service in Essex Market Court, where they were both held under arrest. Now, this story offers details of minor events involving unknown figures who do not occupy a significant place in Jewish historiography. And there's a fairly good reason why they don't. No one in it appears to have accomplished anything of significance, either in a Jewish or general framework, nor are the events in question exceptional in a way that would seem to warrant serious analysis. However, it is of note that there are thousands of similar stories reported upon in the Yiddish press from the 1870s through about the 1950s, a matter which permits us to look at issues like violence or failure, as well as their often unpleasant consequences, as distinct phenomena within Jewish life. And taken as a whole, stories of the Jewish lowlife can thus be considered a matter for serious study. Now, Jewish history, like most other history, is largely about elites. Rabbis, scholars, writers, artists, politicians, science, and business people rightly fill the rosters of Jewish history books. There's also been, over the last 30 or 40 years, a focus on social history, but that also has a kind of upwardly mobile trajectory. Studies like Hasia Diner's on Jewish peddlers or Adam Mendelssohn's on Jewish garment workers invariably begin with figures of modest origins and end with phenomenal commercial accomplishments. Even ostensibly lowbrow studies of Jewish gangsters like Robert Rockaway's and Jenna Weissman-Joslitz are framed as upwardly mobile histories of perseverance that, despite engaging in highly illegal activities, conclude with great financial success. So what is clearly evident is that the historiography is full of Jewish success stories. And this doubtlessly makes sense, since this is the general trajectory of most historiography. But it is also of note that all of these histories have their origins in severe poverty, upheaval, and immigration, all of which occurred on a mass scale for Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So what, therefore, of a consideration of downwardly mobile Jews? The failures, either those who didn't succeed or who faced traumatic life experiences that exacerbated already problematic situations. Were the blockheads, the failures, or the plain strange in the Jewish past? The brief report about Joseph Rand and Herman Garber fighting in Shul on Yom Kippur that I read at the outset represents a little-known but eminently interesting corner of Jewish history, one that reveals aspects of Jewish life that have largely escaped the purview of historians. Now, if most Jewish history books focus on elites, then it's likely that they tend not to consider figures like abortionists, murderers, rioters, prostitutes, bigamists, drunks, extortionists, psychics, and charlatans. But this book does. In it, you'll find a man by the name of Rosenzweig who accidentally kills a woman and decides that rather than dispose of the body properly in New York, where he lives, that it's a better idea to pack it in a trunk and mail it to Chicago. Then there's Pesach Rubenstein, who decides to murder his housekeeper / cousin / lover because he accidentally got her pregnant and discovered that his real wife is on her way over to the United States from Poland. Among others, there's a 1927 rabbinical court hearing in Warsaw during which the rabbis had to call the police because litigants in a divorce proceeding were smashing chairs over each other's heads and destroying the courtroom. Apparently just another day in Yiddishland. Now, as noted, marginal events and figures like these do not appear very often in Jewish history books. Scholars haven't taken much interest in Yiddish-speaking sideshow performers, professional wrestlers, or pickpockets. But Yiddish journalists did take an interest, and so did their readers. And their stories fill up the pages of Yiddish daily newspapers, the first form of mass media among Jews, and one of the only places that you will find Jews of all kinds, from brilliant scientists to circus freaks, from rabbis and scholars to tattoo artists and drag queens. The best and worst of everything appear on the same pages of Yiddish newspapers, sandwiched together among announcements for things like public debates on the existence of God and advertisements for post-Passover constipation products. These among millions of other things you've probably never heard of if you don't read the Yiddish Press. Now, one of the odd things about the Yiddish Press is the way in which it got started. One might think there would have been dozens of Yiddish newspapers in 19th century Eastern Europe, which at the time held the largest Jewish population in the world, about 4 to 5 million Jews, the vast majority of whom used Yiddish as their vernacular. But this region, known as the Pale of Settlement, was controlled by the Russian government and was the area to which they restricted their empire's Jews. Now, under Russian rule, Jews were not permitted to own land, they were limited to certain kinds of occupations, and were forced to pay special taxes, among other oppressive issues that made their lives difficult. So it goes without saying that a free press in Yiddish, or really in any other language, was not a possibility in this place and time. But when Tsar Alexander II assumed the throne in 1855, this began to change. In addition to freeing the serfs, he changed some of the legislation surrounding Jews, allowing them a bit more freedom. Some of the Jewish intellectuals involved in the Haskalah, or the Jewish Enlightenment movement, which sought to emancipate Jewish life, saw this as an opportunity to begin publishing newspapers, which they had seen in languages like Russian and German. In particular, a wealthy Odessa-based women's wear manufacturer named Alexander Zederboim thought it would be a good idea to publish a newspaper to disseminate news to the Jews of the Pale. So with the government connections that he had, he obtained permission to publish a weekly newspaper in Hebrew called Hamelitz, and this is what it looked like. So why publish a newspaper in Hebrew, a liturgical language that no one spoke at the time? This started coming out in 1860. Hebrew had become the literary language of a small coterie of intellectuals of which Zederboim was a member. His choice of Hebrew reflects the attitude of Jewish intellectuals toward Yiddish, one that was almost uniformly negative. Jewish elites, many of whom spoke the language themselves, considered Yiddish to be barbaric and deformed, and its speakers, meaning the vast majority of Eastern European Jews, incapable of intelligent thought as long as they spoke it. As long as the Jews speak this jargon, or Yiddish as they called it, they thought the masses would never become civilized, nor would they be able to become proper citizens in the countries in which they resided. So when Zederboim launched his Hebrew paper in 1860, he was only able to get a few hundred subscribers, which, to be honest, was a pretty shabby result for the region with the largest Jewish community in the world. Now, one of his stated motivations was to educate the Jews of the Pale. And when he realized he wouldn't be able to do it using this Hebrew newspaper, he came to understand that if he wanted a mass audience of any kind, he would have to do it in Yiddish. So in 1862, he decided to launch Kol Mavasar, the first Yiddish weekly in the Russian Empire. And this is the first page of the first issue, which came out in October 1862. And I can just point out that this first article that you see before you is about the American Civil War. And it's likely that this is the first time that Yiddish readers are hearing about this. And it's really kind of a fascinating article and told from a very naive point of view. They say that, they actually come out and say, we don't know much about this new country, America, but we heard that it's pretty good. They don't seem to care if you're a Jew or a Christian, and it's run by businessmen. It's apparently still run by businessmen. So they were very prescient, but I don't know how well that's serving us. It's another matter. In any case, this newspaper would become one of the most important developments in Jewish cultural life in the 19th century. Notably, it became the cradle for modern Yiddish literature. Serialized novels were published in weekly installments. Among them were biting social satires written by authors of outstanding quality. Readers clamored for this material, and on the occasion that a weekly installment didn't appear when it was supposed to, the paper was deluged with letters demanding an answer as to why. It is also of note that the literary element is the best known aspect of Kol Mavasar and its history, which is really a testament to the dominance of literary scholarship in Yiddish studies. And unfortunately, interest in the paper's literary component has obscured other aspects, notably the ways in which it brought all kinds of information about the wider world, about current affairs, history, and science into the small shtetl in which Jews lived, matters which were no less important than the literary component to its readers. And I'll give you one example of this. In the third issue of the paper, which appeared in early November 1862, there was an article about the giant sequoia trees in California. And this is doubtlessly the first time that Yiddish readers of the Pale of Settlement are hearing of any such thing, either giant trees or California. And they are described as being considered to 8 to 10,000 years old, taller than the tallest tower that the readers have ever seen, and wider than the widest house they've ever seen. They have to be described in very simple terms to people who have no way to conceive of such a thing. Now, about a month after this article appeared, a letter to the editor is printed in the paper. And it says, "Dear editor, I very much like your newspaper and was especially interested in this article you published on these giant trees in this place called California. However, I think you must have made a mistake, because how can a tree be 8 to 10,000 years old when the world itself is only 5,623 years old?" So in a nutshell, this explains both the breadth of knowledge of Jews in the shtetl and also the ways in which the newspaper completely exploded their worldviews. Now, as scholars such as Sarah Stein and Nati Cohen have observed, newspapers were largely responsible for making Jews modern. Yiddish newspapers taught Jews all about the world around them and served as guides to their new lives in big cities or in new countries. The only form of mass media available to them, Yiddish newspapers not only filled them with information about the world and local affairs and taught them about history and politics, these papers also taught them how to survive in new environments. And I'll just show it as an example. This is the first page of the first edition of the Vorwärts, which was the largest and best-selling Yiddish newspaper in history. Sadly, its last print edition is in Zachary Baker's hand. This is the final print edition of this newspaper. After 122 years, it's going out of print. It will remain online, but it's really the end of an era when something like this leaves print. I'll just point out one tidbit. One of the articles on this front page discusses how since Jews, and this is from April 22nd, 1897. The article discusses how since Jews have moved into the Lower East Side en masse and have supplanted Irish immigrants, all of the Irish pubs that had dotted the neighborhood have disappeared and have been replaced by a particular kind of shop that all Jews need much more than any other kind of shop. It's not a kosher butcher. It's pharmacies. Jews need pharmacies. They need to medicate, and that's what the purpose of this article. So Yiddish newspapers provided really a great deal to Jews, Jewish immigrants. These newspapers taught Jews all kinds of things. It taught them how to vote, how to buy insurance, how to walk down the street without getting pickpocketed, how to buy a pair of shoes without getting ripped off, all kinds of seemingly simple matters that confronted them when they arrived in a new city or in a new country. The Yiddish Press even did things like teach them how to play baseball. Here's an article from 1909 that explains how to play baseball in Yiddish. I don't think the editors thought that immigrant Jews would run out and play, but they understood. Although I'm sure some of them did, but they understood that their children played, and this was an important component of the acculturation process. To know what this pastime was. The Yiddish newspapers also gave them all kinds of advice about their love lives. This is an example of a Bintel Brief, a bundle of letters, which was one of the most popular columns in the Vorwärts, in which readers wrote in with all kinds of problems, typically advice to the lovelorn kinds of issues, but also political issues, social issues, cultural issues, and the editors gave them advice. Now, what's interesting here is that writing and writers began to play an enormously important role in the modernization and secularization of Jews. And regarding the role of the writer in modern Jewish society, in the early 20th century, Alexander Mukdoini, a Yiddish cultural critic, wrote the following, and I'm quoting: "The writer had become a new kind of rabbi, not one that takes payments for queries, not one that gives blessings and advice, but one who teaches. He says something new, something beautiful, something electrifying." End quote. So for an increasingly secular Jewry, writers and journalists were part of a new intellectual class that were supplanting rabbis as a communal authority. Now, as it grew into a true mass media during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Yiddish Press would eventually cater to virtually every political and social orientation. Everything from anarchist to traditionally religious, and whatever lay between on that spectrum, appeared on newsstands. Because the press was the only form of mass media, and this is something that I always have to emphasize to students, people today sit in bed and the whole world comes to them on their telephone. It's hard to imagine that, at some point in time you had to leave your apartment or leave your home, walk down the block and buy the news in a sheaf of papers. It's so strange to younger people. In any case, for a culture that Jewish intellectuals considered devoid of intelligent thought, meaning Yiddish culture, the variety of Yiddish publications that came into existence beginning in the early 20th century is absolutely staggering. There was quite literally something for everyone. And very quickly, I just want to show you what some of these newspapers and other publications looked like, just so you could get an idea of what they appear, how they appear visually. So this is Yiddish's Tageblatt. This was the first Yiddish daily newspaper in the United States, began publishing in 1884. It had a kind of orthodox but also sensationalistic orientation. And you already saw the Vorwärts. I showed that earlier. That was a socialist paper, but also a bit sensationalistic during certain periods. This is the Wahrheit. This was a socialist Zionist offshoot of the Vorwärts, also very sensationalistic. The Freie Arbeiter Stimme. This is an anarchist weekly. If you want to read articles by Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, if you want to read about free love, this is where you go. The Morgen Journal, Orthodox paper. But these papers were often read by all kinds of people. So the Morgen Journal was the only major morning newspaper. Most of the newspapers were published in the afternoons and evenings. This was published in the morning because it had a lot of classified ads. So if you were looking for a job, this is the newspaper you'd buy.
The one about the free love was from which year?
Oh, it's multiple years, but around the first decade of the 20th century. It's a good decade. This is their Taube. This is a more sort of intellectual newspaper, if you could call it that, a kind of New York Times of the Yiddish world. This is the Freiheit. This is the Communist Daily. Then you had dozens and dozens of weeklies and monthlies. So here's a women's magazine for Yiddish readers. Magazine for Yiddish farmers, Yiddish-speaking farmers. If you need to learn about raising chickens or growing potatoes, this is your source. Schriften, this is a magazine of literature and the arts that came out in the second decade of the 20th century. There was also a very active and boisterous Yiddish humor press where you could find political cartoons and lots of parodies of the news. This would be kind of a daily show in Yiddish in print form, if you can imagine something like that. Here's a socialist literary magazine, communist literary magazine. Never the twain shall meet. But what's interesting here, what I'd really like to show is the art on a lot of these magazines is quite interesting. Here's a magazine for theater and literature. These are two publications for Yiddish-speaking vegetarians. Vegetarianism has come back in great force in recent years. It's not a new trend. It's very popular 100 years ago. You also had a lot of occupational magazines, and this is just one example. This is called Der Laundryman. This is the laundryman. It's for Yiddish-speaking owners of hand laundries, which was very common, 100 years ago. And one thing I should point out that I personally find interesting about these occupational magazines, and every occupation had one. There's the butcher worker magazine, there's the hotel owner magazine, the hat maker magazine, the waist maker magazine. They all, without fault, have original poetry in them. And that's amazing. Because magazines, I was at my dry cleaner last week, and they have a dry cleaner magazine that was on the table when I was in there. I looked through it, no poetry. So something that's disappeared. Now, because the press was much more free in the United States, Yiddish publishers and writers didn't have any difficulty publishing essentially whatever they wanted. In Eastern Europe, in the Russian Empire, it was a far different story. During the 19th century, the number of Yiddish publications was extremely limited. In fact, during the entire century, there were only 2 weekly Yiddish publications permitted during the 1860s and during the 1880s, and that was it. The Russians only allowed a daily to begin publishing in 1903, which is very late. This is it. It's called Der Freund, and they only allowed it because, in order to counter the popularity of the illegal underground socialist press, they felt that if they permitted a Yiddish daily, people would stop reading the Yiddish socialist, the illegal socialist press. People continue to read both, but this was the advent of a Yiddish, an active Yiddish press in Eastern Europe. You'd eventually have much more. This newspaper, Heint, began publishing in 1908 out of Warsaw. It would become the most popular and successful Yiddish newspaper in interwar Poland, and it had a Zionist orientation. Then you had Moment, which began publication in 1911, also in Warsaw, which is really the cultural center of Jewish Eastern Europe. And this was originally published by a political and cultural organization called the Folkists, who were simply pro-Yiddish culture, in a nutshell. Then you would later have newspapers in independent Poland like this, Unser Express, which began publication in 1926. And this is kind of sensationalistic tabloid daily, if you will. As with the United States, you also had a lot of weeklies and monthlies. This is Literarische Blätter, a literary weekly, which would be the Yiddish equivalent of the New York Review of Books. Now, one interesting phenomenon in Eastern Europe is that when Yiddish publications became extremely popular, initially Orthodox rabbis did not want to permit publications by Orthodox people. And that they eventually realized was a mistake because Orthodox Jews began reading all the newspapers they could find. So the rabbis realized that they didn't want their constituents reading secular newspapers, so they developed their own press, and this is one example. This is Orthodoxische Jugendblätter, or Orthodox Youth newspaper. And this is a literary magazine for Orthodox kids. On the other side of this coin is a magazine like this. This is called the Freidenker, or the Freethinker. This is a magazine for Yiddish-speaking atheists. And this was this was published by a notoriously provocative organization who was well known for giving out free food on Yom Kippur, but only to Jews. You couldn't. You had to be Jewish to get free food on Yom Kippur, because you had to break the holiday. That was the whole point. You also had magazines like this, Der Jiddische Emigrant, the Jewish Immigrant. By 1924, the doors to the United States and many other places had closed to Jewish immigrants, and people were still looking for places to go. Economically, Poland was a disaster. It was socially and politically as well. So a magazine like this contains articles about all kinds of places that were accepting certain numbers of Jews. So you can find articles about Australia and its Jewish community, the Dominican Republic and its Jewish community, and the possibilities for emigration to all kinds of places like that. If you wanted to read about sports in Yiddish, you would buy the Sportzeitung, the sports newspaper. This is a weekly published in Warsaw. If you needed to know about boxing results and soccer and hockey, this is where you would go to find these things. There were also a number of popular health magazines. This is called Volksgesund, or People's Health, and this provided all kinds of valuable information to Yiddish readers who may not have known simple things like why you should wash fruits and vegetables before you eat them. It had articles about different diseases, how to protect yourself from them, all kinds of valuable health information. It also had articles like this, the title of which is Nicht Speien auf der Podloge, Don't Spit on the Floor. So why is there a need for an article like this? So when, during the early part of the 20th century, when hundreds of thousands of Jews were moving from small shtetl to the cities, their homes in towns and villages often had dirt floors that they would put hay on. So you could spit on the floor and just cover it up. But when you came to the city, you typically had a wood floor. And if you spit on the floor, it just sort of sat there and it was unsanitary. So this is all explained in this article. And it doesn't seem like there'd be a need for such a thing, but apparently there was. As in New York, there was also a very active humor press with all kinds of cartoons and parodies of the news and things like that. I'd also just like to point out one interesting thing. So I already mentioned that I work at YIVO, and YIVO holds the largest collection of materials relating to Eastern Europe in the world, I believe. And we have a photo archive of, I think, about 300,000 photographs, many of them from Eastern Europe. And I happened to find by chance a fairly large number of photographs of people posing with newspapers they read. And this is interesting because in this time and place, people didn't take a lot of photographs. I mean, today everyone takes a photograph every 5 minutes, even less. It's very common. But then photographs were a much more valuable thing. You sat and posed for a photograph. You may have only a few photographs of yourself and your family, in your entire life. So a photograph was really something special. So the fact that people sat and posed with newspapers they read is an indication of how important these things were and how people identified with them. So these are just photographs of students in schools and in libraries posing with the newspapers they read. You also have the same phenomenon with individuals, and it spans the gamut from, here's a young Orthodox man posing with the newspaper he read, and here's a young socialist posing with the newspaper, he read. So it's really kind of an interesting phenomenon. You also have here the same thing in New York. Here, workers, posing with a copy of the Vorwärts, the newspaper that they read. Sorry. Okay. So now back to our regularly scheduled program. So the late 19th and early 20th century heyday of the Yiddish Press is really a disjointed chronicle of Jewish urban life that tells stories about the Jewish past that cannot be found anywhere else. The Yiddish Press contains an enormous amount of data on Jewish life of the period, ranging from politics to literature and theater to religion and daily life, which are really the things that people remember as having been recorded by daily newspapers. But there's really so much more. So during the course of research that I did, I was required to read the Yiddish Press extensively. And in doing so, I began to find all kinds of strange stories about Jewish criminals, Jewish imbeciles, and failures. And these journalistic reports presented aspects of migrant and immigrant Jewry that, after having spent years in Jewish history classes and after having read thousands and thousands of pages of Jewish history text, that I'd never heard of. I'd never even conceived of them. I also realized that academic explorations of the seamier aspects of Jewish life were extremely limited, and I concluded that at some level it was important that common people and their problems should become part of the historical record. So the forgotten stories that I chronicle in my book provide a look at the seamy underbelly of Jewish urban life. They offer a peek into the frequently troubled world of migrants in big cities, where any misstep is potential news. So I want to talk a bit about the ways in which I fell into this project. Methodologically, it was a total accident. I didn't go looking for these stories, but I stumbled into them during the course of doing research on other things, or in some cases, just sitting around. So here's one example. When I was in graduate school, a friend of mine who worked in the rare book room of the Jewish Theological Seminary asked if I would take a look at a strange-looking Yiddish newspaper that he had found. It was uncatalogued and undated, and it wasn't typeset, but handwritten and lithographed. What's more, and this is what it looks like. What's more, it had a number of images on it, some of them gruesome, including one of a murder scene and another of the police showing a frightened man, a dead body in a morgue. I had never seen a Yiddish newspaper that looked like this, and I was intrigued. So I read the text, which turned out to be about a man by the name of Pesach Rubenstein, who I mentioned at the outset, who had allegedly murdered his cousin/lover/housekeeper after getting her pregnant and then discovering that his own wife was on her way over to the United States. So I had never heard of this unusual case, and I immediately went to the American Jewish History section of the library and began pulling books off shelves and looking through their indexes for Pesach Rubenstein or other names that were salient to the case. So I pulled probably between 40 and 50 books off of the shelves and looked through their indexes. I found 3 that mentioned the case. One of them had 2 sentences about it, one of them had a paragraph, and one of them had a page and a half. So the dearth of information on Rubenstein would later surprise me, because when I began to really research it, I found much, much more. And what happened was, and this was, I'm going to say this is like 2003, 2004, there was a new database had appeared of American newspapers, not American Jewish newspapers, but American newspapers from the 17th century to 1922, when at the time copyright was cut off. So this had hundreds and hundreds of newspapers in it from all over the country. And it was this new database that I was eager to use. So I typed in the name Pesach Rubenstein, and I got 999 hits. I was completely shocked because there was almost nothing in Jewish historiography texts. Yet what I discovered was that virtually every newspaper in the United States, from the New York Times to the Brooklyn Daily Eagle to newspapers in San Francisco, Idaho, Missouri, all over the country wrote about the Pesach Rubenstein case. This was the OJ trial of 1876. It was absolutely huge. Not only did almost every newspaper in the country write about it, but in the wake of the trial, or after the trial took place, the entire trial transcript was published as a book for popular consumption. In addition, there's a really interesting American publishing phenomenon called murder pamphlets. It's a 19th century publishing phenomenon where significant murder cases would have 8 to 16 page illustrated pamphlets that were really a precursor to pulp literature. And there are usually 1 or 2 pamphlets published for usual murder cases. For the Pesach Rubenstein case, there were 4 murder pamphlets published. In addition, I found in an anthology of popular songs from the 1870s a song called "My Name is Pesach Rubenstein." So this was a really big deal. I also found in the autobiography of Abraham Cahan, who was the editor of the Vorwärts, this Yiddish daily newspaper that I showed you before. He emigrated to the United States he arrived in 1881. And he writes that when he arrived in New York, everyone was talking about the Pesach Rubenstein case. He arrived 5 years after the Pesach Rubenstein case. So it was clearly a major event. But it was, even as a seminal event in the history of the Jewish settlement on the Lower East Side, it had been completely ignored, or almost completely ignored, and essentially lost to history until I stumbled into it by sheer chance by someone showing me this newspaper. Now, another way in which I fell into some of these strange stories was thanks to cartoons. My dissertation was on cartoons of the Yiddish Press, and during the course of my research, I sometimes found cartoons that I didn't understand, or I didn't recognize the characters that I saw in them. And what I came to understand was that these images often revealed aspects of Jewish history about which I had never heard. So, for example, I was researching cartoons in the Warsaw Yiddish Press in the spring of 1929. That's not when I was researching them, but that's what I was researching. I began to find cartoons of a young woman with straight black hair, ample cleavage, and a unibrow. So this is one of the cartoons. And here are a couple of others. The same sort of woman is appearing in dozens of cartoons in Yiddish humor magazines. And just to give you a sense of what Yiddish humor magazines were like, the headline of this is, "Ay, ay, ay, look at those matzo balls." So when I first saw these, I didn't really know who this person was, but she always looked the same. She was marked as Miss Judea or Miss Judea. And so I started to read the daily papers to figure out what this was. And it turned out that it had to do with a beauty pageant to choose the most beautiful Jewish girl in Poland. In brief, a Polish language Jewish paper organized this pageant because they figured no Jewish girl would ever win the Miss Poland contests. So they put out an open call for Jewish girls across the country to send in photographs of themselves, which they printed in their weekly illustrated supplement. And after printing hundreds of photographs, they allowed readers to choose 10 finalists who would take part in a runoff gala pageant at the posh Hotel Polonia. a winner was chosen. This is her. Her name is Sophia Oldak. You could sort of see the resemblance to a certain degree with the images. So in the wake of her victory, in the wake of her win as Miss Judea, she was brought around to all the Jewish organizations in the city for photo opportunities. She was brought to the Yiddish theater to take photos with Yiddish theater actors. She was brought to Yiddish, various Yiddish, to take photos with various Yiddish writers. In other Jewish organizations, there's an amazing photograph of her with Janusz Korczak, this famous pedagogue, and the orphans he took care of. She was really carted all over town. She was also invited to the Jewish Community Council, the Kehila, which was a quasi-governmental organization to which Jews paid taxes and received various services like Jewish schools, cemeteries, homes for the aged, homes for the indigent, orphanages, things like that. It was a sort of a quasi-government for the Jewish community. So she was invited to the Jewish Community Council, which held a sumptuous banquet in her honor. The president of the council, who was also the president of the Mizrahi religious Zionist political party, stood up, praised her beauty, and sang her a portion of the Song of Songs. So I don't know if you're familiar with Song of Songs, but it's essentially an erotic poem that was smuggled into the Bible. So this took place at the banquet. Now, it doesn't necessarily seem particularly egregious, but when the ultra-Orthodox political parties found out about it, they were absolutely furious. They decried what they perceived to be a desecration of the community council and a desecration of Song of Songs. So they do what is still done in Israel today. They brought all of the boys out of their yeshivas to protest in the Kehila, the community council president, in front of the stately community building on 26 Grzybowska Street. Now, when the organizers of the pageant, the editors of the secular Polish language Jewish newspaper Nasz Przegląd, found out about this, they organized a counter-protest on the other side of the street in front of the community council building. So on one side of the street you had yeshiva boys protesting, on the other side of the street you had secular Jews protesting, and in the middle you had Polish policemen who were really wondering what was going on with the Jews. So about a week after this happened, the protests began to die down. It was a brief convulsion that occurred, and Jewish Warsaw began to function as it had before this happened. Now, a week after that, the vice president of the community council, and who was also the president of the largest ultra-Orthodox political party, the Agudas Yisrael, passed away. Not because of these events, but because he was an elderly man, and he died of natural causes. But a funeral had to be organized for him, which would essentially be a Jewish state funeral in Warsaw, at which you would have 15 to 20,000 Hasidic mourners. You would also have every major rabbi give a eulogy, and also the president of the community council would have to give a eulogy in the name of the community. So Heschel Farbstein, who was the head of the president of the community council, understood that this would potentially be problematic because of what had happened 2 weeks before. So he went to the deceased's family and asked if it would be okay if he gave a eulogy in the name of the community. They said, absolutely, you must give a eulogy. This is not a political event. This is a funeral of an esteemed member of the community. Yes, you will give your eulogy. Now, when he arrived at the funeral and mounted the dais, the yeshiva boys who had been protesting him a few weeks before saw him and began stamping their feet and screaming, "Miss Judea, Miss Judea, Miss Judea, Miss Judea." he realized that his eulogy was not going to happen, and he was hustled out of the cemetery. Now, all of these yeshiva boys wouldn't stop chanting, and the rabbis who were on the dais and the older mourners in the cemetery started to tell them to shut up. They wouldn't back down. They started pushing and shoving. Canes started swinging. Streimel started flying. The dais was smashed so people could take pieces of wood to beat each other with. And as people were fighting and screaming around the gravesite, an esteemed rabbi and leader of Warsaw's Jewish community was lowered to his eternal rest. So needless to say, it was a major scandal. So what's interesting here is just by looking at old cartoons, I accidentally dredged up a fascinating story that dealt with a wide variety of cultural, social, journalistic, religious, and political aspects of Jewish life in Warsaw between the two world wars. Now, this is a strange event to be sure, but it's one that reflected an incredibly diverse community engaged in a wide variety of activities. Now, just by looking at cartoons, I discovered many such revealing stories, tales of communal affairs that hadn't been considered by historians, but which, to my mind, complemented traditional historiography by adding a different and distinctly human dimension to it. Now, another time during my research, during my work researching cartoons in Warsaw's Yiddish Press, I realized that cartoons only appeared in Friday editions of Warsaw's newspapers. So what that meant to me was that since I was using microfilm, and I don't know how many of you have used microfilm, but it's not the most exciting way to do research. But what that meant was that I could turn the dial and jump from Friday to Friday and skip everything in the middle of the week because I was only looking for cartoons that appeared in the Friday edition. So I was working in, I believe it was 1920, also 1929, and I was spinning the dial, going from Friday to Friday at a steady clip, photocopying the cartoons that I needed. And I turned the dial once, and I accidentally wound up landing on a Thursday. Now, that had happened occasionally, and I usually just continued on to Friday, but the headline in front of me read, "Two Wives, Blazing Punches, and the Police." And I thought, okay, that sounds kind of interesting. So I read the story, and it turns out to be about a Hasidic man who fell in love with his wife's best friend. He secretly married her and set her up in an apartment outside of town. And he shuttled between the two women, telling the first wife he was away on business while he was visiting his second wife. The first wife's neighbors figured out what was going on, and they told his older brother, who was a fanatically religious Chosid, who organized or who arranged a hearing at the Warsaw Rabbinical Court, to which he physically dragged his brother to. When they arrived, both wives were there. There was a panel of 3 judges and about 30 members of the first wife's family. The rabbis ruled that he had to divorce both women, which they did on the spot. They wrote out writs of divorce, they gave them to him, he signed them, he gave them to the women, who handed them back to the rabbis, making the divorces official. As soon as the divorces were official, his older brother ran over to him, punched him in the face. The 30 members of the first wife's family ran over to the second wife and began beating her. The rabbis ran out, and the shamus, or their assistant, called the police, who arrested everyone. And I sat there in front of the microfilm reader and thought, wow, this is an amazing story. And so from that point on, instead of jumping from Friday to Friday, spinning the dial, I scrolled very slowly through the daily papers and scanned for headlines of these kinds of stories. And what I discovered was that reportage from the rabbinical court was a common feature of Yiddish daily newspapers. I also discovered that Isaac Bashevis Singer and his older brother, Israel Joshua Singer, were both assigned to this beat and both reported from the rabbinical court. They were so popular that these types of stories were so popular that in 1927, the Jewish Community Council tried to ban journalists from attending these cases because they found the press reports embarrassing and distasteful. But the demand was rebuffed by the rabbis who sat on the court, who said that traditionally the rabbinical court was open to the public and should remain that way. Now, what's interesting here is I also found a fair number of cartoons that deal with this very issue. So this cartoon is called New Furniture in the Rabbinate, and the rabbi's assistant says, it's a shame to bring this new furniture in. So it's a shame to bring that stuff in. It'll all be smashed. After one case, it's kaput. Here's another similar one. This is called Ready for Destruction. It's two men standing outside of a window where all sorts of chaos is taking place. What's going on? Another Kahila meeting or another community council meeting? No, it's a divorce case in the rabbinate. Here's a man coming to the door of the rabbinate. It says, I hear they're having a wrestling match here. I came to buy a ticket. Here's gas masks as a security measure in the rabbinate. It says, now we can begin the case, call in the appellants. And this has to do with a real case that took place in which a woman came in and began spraying vitriolic acid on her soon-to-be ex-husband and her in-laws. There's one last one here. This is protected from getting punched in a brawl. New, we can start calling the couple who wants a divorce. We're fully protected. And I could just read you a couple of these just to give you an idea of what they sound like. This article is from Moment, the daily newspaper Moment from February 12th, 1934. The title is A Hot and Bloody Day in the Rabbinate. It goes as follows. Yesterday in the rabbinate was a hot one and bloody too. Good sense was butchered and the blood flowed like water, and rest assured that the rabbis ran out in the middle of these cases. All of the disputes broke out in connection with divorce proceedings, which unfortunately have occurred all too often as of late. The first fight occurred between the owner of the Garden restaurant, 45-year-old Masha Becker, and her second husband, 25-year-old Yitzchak Lerner, an employee in her restaurant. 5 years ago, Becker's first husband died, and she took Lerner the waiter as her husband. But in the restaurant, she still treated him like a servant. Lerner refused to put up with that and called his wife to the rabbinate and asked to have her sign the business over to him. Words were exchanged and Lerner slapped his wife. This didn't even seem to bother her, and she blackened his face with the contents of an inkwell. No agreement was reached. A second couple beat each other up over a heated issue. A certain Leibel Nyman was a frequent guest at his fiancée's house, where he would come to eat and occasionally sleep over until his fiancée ended up with a butt in the oven. But in front of the rabbi, he said he didn't know anything about it. What, the girl screamed? Now you don't know anything? Here, now you'll know something. And she punched him in the mouth so hard that she knocked out 2 of his teeth and completely soaked him in blood. A third case did not even make it into the courtroom. It played out in the hallway. A young man with 4 women, 2 wives and 2 brides, showed up in the hall. They pounded one another so badly before the trial that the police had to be called, who were able to pull the combatants apart only after great effort. What a hot day it was yesterday in the rabbinate. Now, to be clear, it wasn't the divorce cases that brought these goings-on in the rabbinical court to the attention of Warsaw's Yiddish journalists, but the violence, or the possibility of violence, the element that made this story so appealing. In fact, as I mentioned, editors specifically sent journalists to cover these goings-on in the rabbinical court because they knew there were juicy stories unfolding before the rabbis. It's also of note that the Yiddish Press published these stories not only because they were entertaining, but also in order to introduce an element of moral suasion. These stories of Jews gone wild were finely honed examples for the readership of how not to behave. The press, of course, had it both ways. They were able to editorialize on these behaviors while exploiting them as fodder for their reporting. With the understanding that the press had become a major political and social force in Jewish life, there was a desire to exert influence on this socially disenfranchised minority for whom religious mores were becoming less and less relevant. Now, one of the startling aspects of these stories that they revealed a component of Yiddish-speaking Jewry that flew in the face of traditional stereotypes. The plethora of bad and stupid decisions followed by furious anger that explodes in violence occurred so often among these Jews that I'm still surprised that no one ever considered it. While internal Jewish discourse maintains a stereotype that Jews are highly intelligent, the classic Yiddish Kopf or Jewish brain, the stories of Warsaw Jews reported by the journalists of the Yiddish Press provide a radically different picture. In his book of essays on Freud, Jews, and modernism, the historian Peter Gay comments that, quote, "There's a historical and sociological study that desperately needs to be undertaken, that of stupid Jews. The material would be abundant, and the results would correct the widespread and untenable notion that Jews are by endowment more intelligent than other people," end quote. Gay is undoubtedly correct in his assertion that the material would be abundant. The Yiddish Press in its heyday from the turn of the 20th century through the 1930s offers myriad stories of imbecilic Jews caught in an endless array of problematic situations. Not only do they function as an antidote to the unreality of an alleged Jewish brilliance, but they are also a joy to read. And I don't know, how much time do I have? I'll read a couple of these stories. Okay, from the Forverts, New York, March 15th, 1913. 18-year-old Esther Goldberg, a pretty girl who lives at 20 Pitt Street on the Lower East Side, went out early in the morning to the grocery store to get some rolls for breakfast. Suddenly, she saw her neighbor, a young tailor by the name of Harris Bloom, who was coming home late from a dance, getting attacked by a thief who popped Bloom so hard on the head he couldn't see straight. The thief grabbed Bloom's money and took off running. Ms. Goldberg, a Cossack of a girl, however, gave chase. She caught up with the thief on Grand Street and punched him so hard he went tumbling down. With that, she jumped on top of them and pounded him with her fists until he saw stars. The robber was only saved because the police showed up and took him to jail. Let's see, okay. All right, from Warsaw, December 11th, 1927. Gang of well-known criminals is arrested in Yankel Bavarnik's casino. Police investigators have announced that criminal elements have been cheating in Yankel Bavarnik's well-known card club with the use of a new invention, mechanical cards. The trick with these cards is that queens suddenly turn into kings, kings turn into jacks, and numbered cards change from high numbers to low according to the wishes of the cheater. During the course of the investigation, a large number of agents visited Yankel Bavarnik's on Thursday night. A group of 26 people were killing at a game of Tertel Mertel using the mechanical cards. The entire group, along with Yankel Bavarnik, were soon taken into the Investigations Bureau, where it became evident that part of the group consisted of suckers and the rest clever con artists. They included the following: Tuvia Mlinaj, who had come to Warsaw for pleasure from Hamburg, where he's known as a swindler and a safecracker. Václav Barshinsky, a fence. Shmuel Barch, a well-known specialist in the art of pickpocketry. Yankel Torma, who has served time for fraud. Shia Pilz and Ber Yudashka, both well-known crooks. Yitzchak Bronstein and Leib Rafes, both arrested for robbery 6 times. Moishe Lizalevsky, also known as Litvin, regarded as the best lockpicker in Warsaw until a year ago. It's evidently competition. Aaron Schneiderman, a safecracker. Laser Flockstrom, a house burglar. The most interesting character from among those under arrest is the tramway thief, Avram Weisboim, who is known as Lotoronshka or Little Golden Hand. Weissboim is well known in the criminal world not only as an excellent artist, but also for having managed to escape the clutches of every detective in the city. The arresting officers, therefore, ordered Weissboim to be bound in chains. I'll read one more. I'm sorry, they're enjoyable to read. This is from the newspaper Moment in Warsaw, January 3rd, 1938. The headline is "Blind Yankel Opens a University for Thieves." The successful but elderly pickpocket Yankov Pomerantz, also known as Blind Yankel, is very popular in the world of thieves. Mainly, he is regarded as an excellent professional, but has also retired and is living off the advice he gives to youngsters while they attempt to go to work. The advice business has done quite well, but since in today's business world one cannot simply charge money for simple words, Blind Yankel came up with another idea. He thus opened a school for young thieves where he teaches his students both the theory and practice of the profession. Professor Yankel even prepared a lesson with mannequins, which the beginners worked on with straight razors. Afterwards, he would bring his young students out into the streets. The practical street lessons would often take place in the markets, where there's always a lot of noise and action. The school business would have gone quite well, if not for the police. It didn't take long for them to discover this institution of higher learning. Professor Yankel and his two assistants, Shloimi Mandelboim and Yoel Pasternak, landed in Pavyak prison. Also held were a number of young talents, also students of Blind Yankel. Now, as I've mentioned, we don't see very much discussion of Jews like these in historiography. Yet, in the pages of Yiddish newspaper, these Jews were legion. Short tempers and Jew-on-Jew violence were common fare in immigrant and migrant Jewish populations. Living haunch by jowl in poor neighborhoods, Yiddish-speaking immigrants not only had to contend with broken families and poverty, but squalid, overcrowded living quarters, job insecurity, and having to live life in sometimes a new language and often an unfamiliar land. The frequent violence occurs in their communities represents the moments when words failed them and they had no alternative but to raise their fists to communicate. What's more, we find them in every Yiddish newspaper in New York, in Warsaw, or in places like Pinsk. We're lucky that Yiddish journalists had the foresight to record it. Now, when scholars engage in research on Yiddish-speaking Jews, or when families get together and talk about their immigrant forebears, about their bubbies and their zaydies, these are not usually the stories they tell. But these stories are nonetheless part of the Jewish story, and unsavory as some of them may be, they warrant a place in the historical record. Bad Rabbi is a small attempt to retrieve some of the flotsam and jetsam of Yiddishland, the stories of the Jewish two-bit nobodies who would have been otherwise forgotten. Thank you. Happy to take questions.
I'm curious, what happened with the wife of the guy that killed his lover?
The wife, well, you have to buy the book. No, so she came to New York, and I believe she later emigrated to Palestine. There's not much is known, but there, what? He was in prison. He was sentenced to death, but he died before he could be hanged. That was Pesach Rubenstein, yeah. Incidentally, I once gave a lecture on the Pesach Rubenstein story at the Eldridge Street Synagogue in New York, and when it came time for questions, a woman raised her hand and said, Pesach Rubenstein is a distant cousin of mine, which was kind of interesting claim to make. Sorry, go ahead.
Some of these stories bring to mind a little bit the Helm stories, more like the foolish Jews. And I was just wondering if you could comment on, did the Helm stories, which were fictional, made up, were they supplanted by the Yiddish Press? Because who needs fiction when you have...
Right, well, okay, so that's true. Who needs fiction when these stories, or who needs not, yeah, who needs fiction when these stories are so incredible? No, Helm stories remained, a constant of Jewish folklore. They remain, and they are really different from these kinds of stories. The Helm stories are about people who are genuinely, morons, like beyond belief. You know, here you have people who they're not, some of them are genuinely stupid, but mostly they're making bad decisions. You know, some of them are dumb, but it's mostly bad decision making in a lot of cases.
Yeah, how did the rabbinate, or let me rephrase, the rabbinate obviously must have recognized polygamy if they allowed this thing to happen. They had no way to force divorce if the parties were not.
Well, if parties were refused to divorce, you have the problem of agunas or agunot. You know, women who are not able to get married again if their husbands have abandoned them without giving them a get, without giving them a Jewish divorce.
I'm talking about the guy who had two wives in different establishments.
Oh, right. So he was forced to divorce both women.
There was.
You're saying he didn't divorce both women?
There really was no way to force him.
Right.
He allowed himself to be nagged into it.
His brother forced him.
Right.
I mean, there's social pressures. There are all kinds of ways to get people to do these kinds of things. This problem, incidentally, still exists. To a certain degree. More in Israel than here, but there are men who refuse to divorce their wives. Their wives want to go on and live normal lives, but can't because they're not able to get married.
Could you comment about the distribution of some of the newspapers that you showed us earlier in your talk? Was there any primitive ability to be printed in one city and sent elsewhere?
Absolutely.
Or were these very site-specific titles?
Yes. So, for example, as I said, the Vorwärts was the largest and most successful Yiddish newspaper, really anywhere. But there were Detroit editions, Chicago editions, Milwaukee editions. There was a St. Louis edition for a while of the Vorwärts. There was an LA edition. You had that kind of phenomenon, but you also have Yiddish newspapers in every place that there is a Jewish community large enough to have one. That could sometimes mean one or two people. No, that's not true. You would have, there were Yiddish newspapers, sort of freestanding Yiddish newspapers. There was once one in San Francisco, for a short time. And this is a phenomenon that's worldwide. It's not relegated just to the United States, but you have, a significant Yiddish press in Buenos Aires. You have the same in Brazil. You have a Yiddish newspaper in Lima, Peru. You have multiple in Mexico City. You have them in Australia, in South Africa. You have Yiddish newspapers in Shanghai. Print media at this time was the only form of media, and because Jews need to stay, they'd like to be, stay on top of the news and be in communication with one another. The newspaper was a really very important phenomenon, and so they exist everywhere. It's you could always find a Yiddish newspaper.
One more question.
So the rabbinate, was it recognized by Orthodox Jews? What happened to the atheists and the communists? We didn't care about them, right?
Yes.
So that all the stories we hear is about Orthodox.
No, absolutely not. So you have Jews who weren't Orthodox often were married according to Jewish tradition, which required them to get a get or a writ of Jewish divorce, which meant that if they got divorced, they would have to go to the rabbinate to do it. So there were many Jews who weren't Orthodox or Hasidic or whatever that were getting divorces in these places. The story, for example, about Masha Becker and her 25-year-old husband, they weren't Orthodox. They're going to the rabbinate. This is just where you go. I mean, the same phenomenon exists today in Israel. People go to the rabbinate to get a divorce. That's just the nature of it. But you do have numerous instances of Jewish communists or leftists who say that they will not go to the rabbinate to give their wives divorces because they don't recognize the rabbinate. And on the other hand, You also have instances of Jewish leftists who do appear to the rabbinate, appear in the rabbinate for divorce cases, and in fact do recognize the rabbinate. So it's a whole gamut of society. It's not, it ranges as, from anarchists to Orthodox and everyone in between. Okay, out of time, so thank you.